Imagine you hold 51 noble titles, that you're a direct descendant of King James II of England through an illegitimate son, that in your library sit Christopher Columbus's travel diaries, the last will and testament of Ferdinand the Catholic, and the first Bible ever translated into Castilian Spanish. That on the walls of your drawing rooms hang Goyas, Velázquez's, Titian's, Rubens's, and Rembrandt's. That you hold a right, recognized by history, to enter Seville Cathedral on horseback whenever the mood strikes you. And that, at 85 years old, with all that lineage and all that fortune and all those titles, you decide to marry a social security officer from Palencia, whom your own children oppose with everything they have, not as the protagonist of a novel, as a real, documented person, photographed and filmed dancing barefoot at her own wedding reception. That woman existed. Her name was Maria del Rosario Cayetana Fitz-James Stuart y de Silva, and the world knew her simply as the Duchess of Alba. This is the story of Cayetana de Alba, the most extravagant, most free, and most unclassifiable aristocrat that 20th century Spain ever produced. The woman the Guinness World Records certified as the noble woman with the most legally recognized titles on earth. The one who danced with the gypsies of the Sacromonte before dancing with gypsies was acceptable for someone of her class. The one who sat on palace floors to play with her children at a time when Spanish aristocrats simply did not do that sort of thing. The one who turned down Picasso as a portrait painter because her first husband didn't want her posing naked for him. The one who lived exactly as she wished and chose as her own epitaph the most honest line anyone has ever written for themselves. Here lies Cayetana, who lived as she felt. Maria del Rosario, Cayetana, Fitz-James Stuart y de Silva, was born on March 28, 1926 in Madrid. Her full official name is one of the longest any identity document has ever had to bear. Maria del Rosario, Cayetana, Paloma, Alfonsa, Victoria, Eugenia Fernanda, Teresa, Francisca de Paula Lourdes, Antonia, Josefa Fausta, Rita Castor, Dorotea, Santa Esperanza, Fitz-James Stuart y de Silva Falcó y Gurtubay. She was the only child of Jacobo Fitz-James Stuart y Falcó, the 17th Duke of Alba, known to his friends as Jimmy, and of Maria del Rosario de Silva y Gurtubay, Marchioness of San Vicente del Barco, known to hers as Toto. Her godparents at baptism were King Alfonso XIII and Queen Victoria Eugenia. For the ceremony, held on April 17, 1926 in the chapel of the Royal Palace, the baptismal font of St. Dominic of Guzman was brought in, a vessel normally reserved exclusively for the baptisms of monarchs or their direct descendants. It was the first sign of the extraordinary position this little girl would occupy, born into a world where even the ritual objects used in her baptism were different from those the rest of humanity used. A few months after Cayetana was born, her mother fell ill with tuberculosis. In the 1920s, tuberculosis was what cancer would be decades later, incurable, slow, and final. To protect her daughter from contagion, the mother physically separated herself from the child. It was no abandonment. It was the most brutal act of love a parent can perform, stepping away from your own child so as not to kill them. Maria del Rosario died at 33 when Cayetana was 8. It was the first great loss of a life that would accumulate them with the regularity of someone who lives to 88. And it was also, according to those who studied Cayetana's character, the origin of that capacity for love, without reservations, that would define her relationship with the world. Someone who knows from the age of 8 that people leave without warning, learns to love without safety margins. Her father, the 17th Duke of Alba, was the anchor of Cayetana's life. Jacobo Fitz-James Stuart was an extraordinary man, diplomat, politician, intellectual, friend of Churchill, and a familiar face in the finest drawing rooms of Europe. He served as deputy, Minister of Education, Minister of State, and ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was the kind of aristocrat the 20th century still produced in Spain, genuinely educated, genuinely responsible, aware that the family name imposed obligations as well as privileges. And he was also, for Cayetana, the father who compensated for the mother's absence with a presence so intense that many of those who knew her said the man of her life, before any husband, was her father. The lineage Cayetana inherited from her parents is one of the most improbable and most fascinating in all of European nobility. On the paternal side, the Fitz-James Stuarts are direct descendants of King James II of England, the last Catholic monarch of England, overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, who had, with his mistress, Arabella Churchill, an illegitimate son named James Fitz-James. That James became the Duke of Berwick, one of the finest military commanders of his age, who fought across half of Europe, entered the service of Louis XIV of France, and then of Philip V of Spain, and on April 25, 1707, at the Battle of Almansa, led the forces that defeated the army of the rival claimant to the Spanish throne, sealing Philip V's victory in the War of the Spanish Succession. Philip V rewarded him with Spanish noble titles that would, generations later, merge with those of the Duchy of Alba. The Battle of Almansa, which determined that Spain would be a Bourbon monarchy rather than a Habsburg one, and with it a great deal of Spanish political history for the following centuries, was won by the illegitimate son of the Stuart King of England. If anyone ever doubts that history is a novel reality, writes without worrying about plausibility, that detail ought to settle the matter. And Cayetana de Alba was this man's direct descendant, which meant that in her veins ran literally Stuart blood, the blood of the Alvarez de Toledo family who had served the kings of Castile for centuries, the blood of the Silvas and other noble families that the history of Spain had layered into that compound surname across the generations. Cayetana's childhood played out between Madrid, Seville, and the palaces the family owned across Spain. The Palacio de Liria in Madrid, in whose chapel she was baptized and which would be her main residence for decades. The Palacio de las Dueñas in Seville, built between the 15th and 16th centuries, whose name derives from the vanished monastery of Santa Maria de las Dueñas, that once stood immediately beside it, and which would become the most beloved place of her adult life. The Palacio de Monterrey in Salamanca, a standout example of the Spanish Renaissance. It was a childhood of dimensions that ordinary understanding simply cannot process. More palaces than rooms in the houses where most Spaniards of her generation grew up. Cayetana's education was that of European aristocrats of her time: private governess, languages, music, Paris, London. She spoke French and English fluently. She knew how to conduct herself in contexts where protocol was mandatory. And at the same time, she developed from a very young age a second education that was completely different. That of Seville and flamenco, of the gypsies of the Sacromonte in Granada, of the peñas and private parties where people danced without watching the clock. These were two worlds that in theory should not have coexisted in the same person. In Cayetana, they coexisted without apparent contradiction, which was itself a declaration of principles. I choose what I like, not what my class assumes I ought to like. On October 12, 1947, Cayetana de Alba married Luis Martínez de Irujo y Artascos in Seville Cathedral. The press, both Spanish and international, described it as the most expensive wedding in the world. More than 2,500 guests, a ceremony attended by aristocrats from across Europe, a telegram of blessing from Pope Pius XII, and the only time in modern history that a wedding had been celebrated in that sacred space inside the Seville Cathedral, which had hosted only one previous marriage in its entire history. Luis was the son of the Dukes of Sotomayor, and was exactly the sort of husband that Spanish society of 1947 expected a duchess to choose. Well-born, well-bred, no scandals, not a single discordant note in his record. He was also, according to everyone who knew them, someone who genuinely loved Cayetana, and with whom she lived 25 years, that both described as happy. That marriage produced Cayetana's 6 children. Carlos, in 1948, who would inherit the dukedom, and is today the 19th Duke of Alba. Alfonso in 1950, Jacobo in 1954, Fernando in 1959, Cayetano in 1963, and Eugenia in 1968. 6 children in 21 years of marriage, which means Cayetana spent a very significant portion of her best years between pregnancies, births, and nursing, without any of that preventing her from maintaining the social, cultural, and political life that the surname and the character required. She was a mother with the same intensity with which she was a duchess, which in post-war Spain was already in itself extraordinary. The art collection that Cayetana inherited, managed, and in some cases expanded during her lifetime, is one of the reasons the House of Alba occupies a singular place in the cultural history of Spain that no other private family can match. The Palacio de Liria in Madrid, with its more than 3,500 square meters, spread across nearly 200 rooms, holds more than 350 paintings, 52 tapestries, and works by Velázquez, Rubens, Titian, El Greco, Goya, Zurbarán, Murillo, Rembrandt, Picasso, Miro, and Chagall. In its library sit Christopher Columbus's travel diaries, with 24 autographs of the navigator, the last will and testament of Ferdinand the Catholic, the marriage settlement of Joanna of Castile and Philip the Handsome, the first Bible ever translated into Castilian Spanish, dating from 1430 and saved from the Inquisition, and the first edition of Don Quixote. It was the kind of heritage that nation-states keep in their national museums, and which the House of Alba had held in private ownership since before national museums existed. The Palacio de Liria had to be rebuilt after the Spanish Civil War, which left it in ruins. The Republican bombardment of Madrid during the conflict destroyed much of the building. Cayetana, who inherited the dukedom in 1955 following her father's death, personally took charge of the reconstruction using the resources of the House of Alba. The official reopening took place on June 13, 1956. It was the Duchess's first major project, and also the first demonstration that Caya understood the patrimony she administered not as an economic asset, but as a historical obligation. Those palaces, those works of art, those documents had existed before her and had to exist after her. Her role was to guard them with the same seriousness with which her predecessors had accumulated them. Luis Martínez de Irujo died in 1972 from leukemia. Cayetana was 46 years old. The husband with whom she had built an orderly and loving life for 25 years was gone with the speed that illness has when it decides the time has come. And the Cayetana who emerged from that grief was not exactly the same one who had entered it. Something in that loss freed her from the need to keep following the codes of the class that had formed her. Not immediately and not dramatically, but the next decision she made in her personal life would prove it in a way all of Spain would talk about for years. In 1978, 6 years after being widowed, Cayetana de Alba married for the second time. Her second husband was Jesus Aguirre y Ortiz de Zárate, a laicized Jesuit priest, the son of an unmarried mother, a doctor of theology, a first-rank intellectual, and 11 years her junior. Spanish society in the late 1970s, still working its way through the democratic transition, was not entirely prepared for a duchess who married a former priest born out of wedlock. Cayetana's children, according to the accounts of the time, expressed their surprise with the phrase that went down in history. "Mum's going to marry a priest. Unbelievable." The King and Queen of Spain, Juan Carlos I, and Queen Sofia, who were close personal friends of Cayetana, could not attend the wedding because royal protocol forbade monarchs from attending second marriages. Cayetana responded to all the criticism with characteristic directness. "There are people who can't forgive me for marrying an intelligent man, but we are very happy together. We need no one else." It was an answer that said two things at once. She had chosen Jesus Aguirre because he was extraordinarily intelligent, not in spite of his origins, and that the world's opinion of her personal decisions mattered to her exactly as much as her opinion of theirs would have mattered to them. The marriage with Jesus Aguirre lasted 23 years, until his death in May 2001 from a pulmonary embolism. It was, by all available accounts, an intellectually stimulating and emotionally solid relationship. Jesus Aguirre went on to serve as Director General of Books in Felipe González's government, and later as director of the Juan March Foundation. It was the kind of second marriage that breaks every template for what a second marriage is supposed to be. Richer in conversation and freer from convention than the first. Cayetana de Alba's passion for flamenco is one of the elements of her character that is impossible to separate from the rest of her person. It was not the interest of someone who appreciates flamenco from the aesthetic distance of those who regard it as a valuable cultural expression. It was the physical, immediate, unmediated love of someone who from childhood felt in flamenco something no other art form gave her. She went to tablaos and to private parties. She was a close friend of Lola Flores, accompanying her to flamenco gatherings, and in 1961 she became the godmother of the baptism of Lola's only son. While Spanish nobility of her generation attended zarzuela at the Teatro de la Zarzuela, Cayetana went to flamenco in places where no one of her class set foot. When people questioned that incongruity, she smiled the smile of someone for whom the incongruity isn't one. Cayetana's position in the cultural life of 20th century Spain was that of someone who took culture seriously without taking herself seriously. That is an important distinction. There was in her a genuine passion for art, literature, and music that was not the aesthetic consumption of someone with money to spend on it, but the familiarity of someone who had grown up surrounded by works 500 years old and had learned to read them with the same reverence a bibliographer brings to manuscripts. At the same time, there was in her a complete imperviousness to the cultural snobbery that turns knowledge of art into an instrument of social hierarchy. She could discuss Goya with a specialist precision and dance flamenco the same afternoon without feeling that one of the two things contradicted the other. Her friendship with Lola Flores is one of the most revealing examples of how Cayetana's character worked in practice. Lola Flores was, in the 1950s and 1960s, the most visible symbol of popular Spain, the Spain of flamenco and copla, of a culture that aristocrats of European pedigree tended to view with the condescending affection the privileged reserve for the cultural expressions of those below them. Cayetana and Lola were genuinely friends, not bound by the patronage relationship that the Duchess might have had with a popular artist had she been a different sort of person. They were fond of each other, with the kind of warmth that ignores hierarchies because each had found in the other something they couldn't find in their own world. Cayetana was Antonio's godmother, Lola's only son, in 1961. In Franco's Spain, that gesture carried social implications that are difficult to fully imagine today. Cayetana's relationship with popular Spanish culture was not limited to flamenco. She maintained friendships across film, theatre, and the arts that systematically crossed the boundaries of what Spanish aristocracy considered its natural territory. Sophia Loren, Alec Guinness, and James Mason visited the Palacio de Liria during the shooting of the fall of the Roman Empire in 1964. Jackie Kennedy painted her a watercolour during her visit to Seville in the 1960s, which today is preserved at the Palacio de las Dueñas. It was the kind of life that is only possible when someone has the resources to move through all worlds simultaneously, and the character to enjoy each of them without treating anyone as more important than the rest. The story of Picasso and Cayetana is one of the most cited in her biographies and deserves more context than it usually gets. Picasso, who in the 1950s was the most celebrated painter in the world, wanted to paint Cayetana in the nude. The request was not unusual. Picasso painted many women nude, and the Duchess of Alba had the beauty and the character that the Malaga-born painter found irresistible. Cayetana's first husband, Luis Martinez de Irujo, flatly refused, and Cayetana respected her husband's decision, though according to the version that circulated for decades, not without making clear to Picasso that the refusal came from Luis, not from her. It was the perfect image of who Cayetana was, even within a conventional marriage, someone who followed the rules of the institution while making plain that those rules were external to her. The agricultural subsidies the House of Alba received from the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy were one of the most uncomfortable episodes of Cayetana's public life. According to a report by the NGO Oxfam, she and her children received €1,800,000 in cap aid in 2003 alone. It was the image of one of Spain's largest landowners, heir to centuries of land accumulation, that in some cases dated back to medieval lordships, benefiting from a system of agricultural subsidies originally designed to protect small European farmers from global competition. Agricultural unions and the Spanish left turned that figure into a recurring argument about the structural injustice of land concentration in Spain. Cayetana responded by pointing out that the House of Alba paid its taxes and complied with all applicable regulations, which was true. The underlying debate about whether that system was fair was a different matter. The territory the House of Alba has held throughout its history is of an extent that is difficult to visualize in modern terms. Cayetana was considered one of the largest landowners in Spain, with approximately 34,000 hectares under her control, an area equivalent to more than 170 times the Principality of Monaco. They included agricultural estates in Andalusia, Extremadura, and Castile, latifundia that in many cases were the remnants of medieval jurisdictional lordships, which the abolition of feudalism in the 19th century had transformed into private property without fundamentally changing who held them. It was one of the most enduring consequences of medieval Spanish history. Seigneurial power had become private ownership, but it still belonged to the same families. The 1991 expropriation by the Junta de Extremadura of the Cabra Alta and Cabra Baja estates in Badajoz was the most resonant episode in the tension between the Alba patrimony and demands for land redistribution in democratic Spain. The regional government expropriated on grounds of social interest estates that since 1940 had been farmed by a tenants' association from the town of Zahinos. The Duchess received 400 million pesetas in compensation, a significant sum, but far from representing the market value of the land. The expropriation was legal, was challenged in court, and was ultimately carried out. It was the kind of conflict that in Spain's democratic transition put on the table questions society preferred not to ask openly. How much land can a single family own before that becomes a political problem? Cayetana's position in the face of those criticisms was consistent with her general character. She neither denied them nor apologized for them. She acknowledged that the historical origins of the Alba patrimony included centuries of accumulation that in many cases had followed logics the modern world does not consider acceptable. And at the same time, she pointed out that the House of Alba paid its taxes, employed people on its estates and in its palaces, and preserved an artistic and historical heritage that might otherwise not have survived. It was the only available defense of a position that was at its core indefensible in terms of equality, but had its practical logic. Someone had to look after those Goyas and those Velázquezes, and the House of Alba had done so for centuries, with results visible in the drawing rooms of the Palacio de Liria. The Cayetana the world came to know best during the years of Spanish democracy was the one the celebrity press showed. The eccentric duchess, the barefoot dancing noblewoman, the aristocrat who made statements journalists adored because they always contained exactly what journalism needs. Direct, stripped of unnecessary ornament, free of the diplomatic language she had learned in childhood, and consciously set aside when talking about her own life. She was someone the camera found naturally photogenic, not because she posed, but because she never posed. She was always the same person, which meant every photograph was authentic. And then came Alfonso Díaz, the most discussed, most celebrated, and most misunderstood chapter of Cayetana de Alba's life. Alfonso Díaz Carabantes had been born in Palencia in 1950. He was a civil servant at the National Social Security Institute. He was 60 years old when his relationship with the Duchess, who was 82, became public. The age gap was 24 years, though some press accounts of the time inflated it to 25. The international press, including Time magazine, covered the story in the tone it reserved for scandals involving European royal houses. Financial gain as the motive, difference of status as the scandal, the Duchess's advanced age as an element casting doubt on her decision-making capacity. What the press did not know, or did not want to know, was the real story. Alfonso Díaz and Cayetana had crossed paths years earlier in an ordinary context. The city, mutual friends, the kind of encounter that has nothing romantic about it at the time it happens. When they met again outside a cinema, Cayetana was the one who made the move. She grabbed him by the lapel and said, "Don't disappear again." It was the kind of gesture that only people who know exactly what they want and have lived too long to waste time on social protocols that don't serve their real purposes ever make. Alfonso Díez was not the Duchess of Alba. Cayetana knew that perfectly well. What Cayetana saw in Alfonso was a person, not a title or a fortune. Cayetana's children reacted with the mixture of genuine concern and resistance to the unknown that is typical of adult children when their parents make decisions they would not have made themselves. Cayetano Martínez de Irujo, the fifth child, went absolutely ballistic, in Alfonso's own words years later. Others were more receptive. The Duchess's position was absolutely clear. Her children could have opinions, but decisions about her personal life were hers alone. To ensure her children had no financial motive to block the marriage, Cayetana made an advance distribution of a large part of her personal and historical patrimony before a notary in July 2011, before the wedding. Alfonso Díez, for his part, signed a prenuptial agreement with 15 clauses by which he renounced any title, right, or honour the marriage might confer on him. It was the most eloquent gesture available, marrying the richest woman in Spain and keeping nothing of hers. On October 5th, 2011, in the chapel of the Palacio de las Dueñas in Seville, Cayetana de Alba married Alfonso Díez before some 30 guests. The ceremony was small, intimate, almost private compared with the Duchess's previous weddings. But the photographers, waiting in the street, were paying up to €2,000 to rent balconies in the surrounding buildings to photograph the moment. And when the ceremony ended and the newlyweds came out to greet those present, Cayetana de Alba did what no other aristocrat of her generation would have done. She took off her shoes, started dancing flamenco in the open air, and threw her bouquet into the crowd. It was the most Cayetana scene possible. It was exactly her being, exactly herself, at 85 years old, 3 days after publishing her memoirs, and 4 years before dying. It was living proof that some people don't change because they never had to change to be who they were. The story of Cayetana's 3 marriages is also the story of 3 different versions of freedom that she conquered over the course of her life. The first, with Luis Martínez de Irujo in 1947, was the marriage of the world that had formed her, with someone from the same world, the same class, the same protocol. It was also, by all accounts, a genuinely happy marriage. The second, with Jesus Aguirre in 1978, was the marriage of the first break. Someone from the intellectual world, with a past as a priest that scandalized those who needed to be scandalized, and 11 years her junior. The third, with Alfonso Díez in 2011, was the marriage of total freedom. Someone with no title, no recognizable surname, no social network connecting him to her world, 24 years younger, and willing to sign away everything the marriage might give him materially. It was the progression of someone who was learning to choose with less fear as she grew older, which is exactly the opposite of what the world expects to happen. Alfonso Díez says in the documentary, made about the Duchess, that the first thing that struck him about Cayetana was not the Duchess, but the woman. He had never particularly liked the public image of the Duchess of Alba. What he had liked was Cayetana as a person, when they crossed paths in those unplanned contexts where people meet without anyone arranging it. And that distinction between the person and the title was precisely what Cayetana had defended her whole life, that she was Cayetana first and Duchess of Alba second, and that anyone who couldn't see Cayetana behind the title wasn't seeing her at all. Alfonso saw her, she noticed, and the rest followed naturally from that. Cayetana's final years were not easy in terms of health, but they were, according to everyone around her, completely consistent with who she had always been. She travelled with Alfonso through Egypt, Jordan, Sicily, Thailand. She continued appearing at public events. She kept being photographed. She kept generating headlines with the naturalness of someone who has no communications apparatus working to produce them. In November 2014, she was admitted with a complicated pneumonia to the Clínica del Sagrado Corazón in Seville. Her children decided to transfer her to the Palacio de las Dueñas so she could spend her final days in the place she loved most, with her family around her. On November 20th, 2014, she died in Seville. She was 88 years old. More than 70,000 people filed past her lying in state. They were not aristocrats, politicians, or celebrities, though those came too. They were ordinary people who had followed her life for decades in magazine pages, on the evening news, in the stories Cayetana generated, with the regularity of someone who simply lives without worrying about the media consequences of living. The extraordinary turnout was the clearest indicator of what kind of figure she had been. Someone ordinary people felt they truly knew, not because she had deliberately drawn close to them, but because she had never put the distance that the conventional aristocrat places between herself and the world that watches her. Her ashes were placed, at her own wish, with the Hermandad de Gitanos, the Brotherhood of Gypsies, in Seville. It was the most revealing gesture she could have made. The woman with the most noble titles in the world, choosing to let her remains rest in the place that represented the part of Spain she had loved most. The part that no title and no palace could have bought access to, had she not been received there with an open heart. Years later, a portion of her ashes was transferred to the family pantheon of the House of Alba in Madrid. The two halves rested in the two places that had been the two halves of who she was. The library of the Palacio de Liria deserves more attention than it typically receives in analyses of the Alba patrimony, because it is perhaps the most extraordinary element of the entire collection. The 24 autographs of Christopher Columbus it holds represent the largest concentration of handwritten documents by the navigator in any archive in the world. They include his travel diaries to the New World, letters and notes that allow scholars to follow Columbus's thinking during the voyages that changed the history of the planet. They are there because the third Duke of Liria, Jacobo Francisco Fitz-James Stuart y Colon, was a descendant of Christopher Columbus through the female line, and the navigator's documents entered the Alba collection by that genealogical path connecting the Fitz-James Stuarts to the discoverer of America. It is the kind of coincidence that only happens when families have enough history behind them for coincidences to accumulate over centuries. The last will and testament of Ferdinand the Catholic, held in the Liria Library, is another of the documents that make that collection unique. Ferdinand was the king who, together with Isabella the Catholic, unified Spain and sponsored Columbus's voyage. That his testament sits in a private collection rather than in the archive of the Crown of Aragon or the General Archive at Simancas is proof of how inseparable the history of Spain and the history of the House of Alba are. For centuries, the Dukes of Alba were the axis around which much of Spanish politics revolved, which meant the most important documents of that politics ended up in their archives for the most varied of reasons. Cayetana de Alba's relationship with the Spanish media was, for decades, one of the most productive that any non-political public figure ever maintained. Not because she deliberately fed that media cycle, but because her life was genuinely more interesting than anything the media could construct artificially. Every time Cayetana appeared in public, something happened. She said something no one expected. She brought someone no one expected. She did something no one expected. She was the inexhaustible source material for celebrity magazine editors, because she was exactly what celebrity magazines need. A person who lives at the outer edge of convention without calculating it, without a communication strategy, without a team of advisors managing her image. The interview photographs published in 2011, 2 days before her third wedding, are a perfect example of that media relationship. The images, taken in 1982 on a beach in Ibiza, showed Cayetana without the top of her swimsuit. She was 56 years old in those photographs. The magazine sold them as a scandalous revelation. Cayetana commented on them with the same indifference she would have used to comment on the weather. They were nearly 30-year-old photographs from a private beach on a summer 3 decades past. They were not the scandal the magazine wanted them to be, because Cayetana refused to experience them as a scandal. It was the mechanism she used consistently with everything the world tried to turn into a problem for her. She simply didn't turn it into a problem, which was in practice the most effective response available. The estate Cayetana left behind, valued by Forbes at approximately €3 billion at the time of her death, was one of the largest in private hands in Spain. What remained in the Fundación Casa de Alba includes the three main palaces, Liria in Madrid, Dueñas in Seville, and Monterrey in Salamanca, plus castles, estates, and properties distributed across Spain. Her heirs received during the Duchess's own lifetime the portions of the patrimony she decided to distribute, with an agreement that Carlos, the eldest, would manage the foundation and preserve the historical legacy. It was the last management decision of a woman who had, for decades, administered one of the most extraordinary private cultural patrimonies in Europe, with the blend of practical sense and historical responsibility that patrimony required. The Duchess of Alba also left 2 books of memoirs. The first, Yo, Cayetana, published on October 11, 2011, a week after her 3rd wedding. The second, Lo que la vida me ha enseñado, in April 2013. In them, she wrote exactly what she had done in life, without filters, with the directness of someone who has no image to protect, because the image she projects is what it is. The epitaph she chose for herself appears in those memoirs, and is the most accurate distillation of a life that resisted every label. Here lies Cayetana, who lived as she felt. What the story of Cayetana de Alba says about Spain, about the aristocracy, and about the 20th century is something no textbook can adequately summarize. She was the product of a system of wealth and title accumulation that had been operating uninterrupted for centuries, with all the structural injustice that system implies. And she was also a person who used the privileges of that system to live in the freest way her time and context permitted, asking no one's permission, making no apology for her choices, not adjusting her character to the expectations of any social class. She was simultaneously a beneficiary of the most traditional system of Spanish aristocracy, and the person who most naturally broke every rule of that system when those rules got in the way of what she wanted to do. The image of Cayetana dancing barefoot in the courtyard of the Palacio de las Dueñas after marrying Alfonso X is how most people remember her. It is also the most accurate image of who she was, a woman of 85, holding more titles than any noble in the world, marrying who she wanted, dancing where she wanted, exactly as she wanted, without the surname, the lineage, the palaces, the Goyas, and the Velázquezes, obliging her to be anything other than what she had always been. Here lies Cayetana, who lived as she felt. In 2026, the year of the centenary of her birth, the Fundación Casa de Alba has organized a series of commemorative events, including an exhibition at the Palacio de las Dueñas and a documentary titled Cayetana, Duchessa de Todos, which premiered at the Cine Cervantes in Seville before being broadcast on Canal Sur and Netflix. The exhibition was inaugurated in the presence of King Felipe VI, which underlined the institutional dimension of the tribute to someone who had been a personal friend of his father Juan Carlos I and his mother Queen Sofia. The documentary takes in the places most bound to her life, the palaces, the estates, the Seville bullring, the gypsy sanctuary, the Corral de la Moreria in Madrid. It was the portrait of a woman who had inhabited the space between the most formal aristocracy and the most popular Spain, without either world being able to claim her entirely. The legacy of Cayetana de Alba in Spanish popular culture is difficult to measure precisely because it manifested in very different forms. She became the subject of coplas, the song Como la noche y el día, which says 2 names are joined for the history of Spain, one is called Seville and the other is Cayetana, elevated her to the status of an icon within the flamenco tradition on a par with the figures she herself admired. She was a Vogue cover in 1962, in a dress by Elio Berhanier, photographed by Henry Clark, the first Spanish aristocrat to appear in the magazine as a fashion model rather than as a subject of the society pages. The image Cayetana projected of herself over time was not that of the magnanimous duchess who opens her palaces to the people. It was that of someone who simply did not understand why a palace and a flamenco tablao could not be the same world. The distinction between high culture and popular culture that the 20th century turned into a class system within the cultural world was to her as incomprehensible as the distinction between aristocrats and non-aristocrats when it came to deciding with whom she spent her time. She had the specific capacity to make everyone around her feel important, without that being a strategy. She simply gave the same attention to everyone. That was the origin of the extraordinary popularity that drove 70,000 people to queue to say goodbye to her. The contrast between Cayetana de Alba and the rest of the Spanish aristocracy of her generation and later generations is one of the most revealing things about why she remains a figure of fascination, while most of her class contemporaries are completely unknown to the wider public. Spanish aristocracy in the 20th century tended toward invisibility as a survival strategy. Don't appear in the media, don't generate controversy, don't mix with the world beyond traditional circles. It was a lesson learned from the 19th century, when aristocratic overexposure had fed republicanism and anti-clericalism. Cayetana did exactly the opposite. She was always visible, always present, always willing to generate the controversy her genuine character inevitably generated. And paradoxically, that visibility made her more beloved than any invisibility would have protected her. The question the history of Cayetana de Alba keeps asking, in the year of her centenary, is perhaps the same one she herself would have framed with her characteristic directness. How many people in her position would have lived as she lived? Very few. Not because courage is rare, but because the specific combination of character, position, and circumstance that produced Cayetana de Alba is unrepeatable. But being unrepeatable does not make her less instructive. On the contrary, it makes her more valuable as an example of something most people only manage partially over the course of their lives, and that she managed completely and consistently, living as she felt, not as she was expected to. There is an anecdote about Cayetana and bullfighters that perfectly summarizes her relationship with the world that was not hers by birth, but was hers by choice. She was a serious aficionada to bullfighting, with the seriousness of someone who had grown up in Seville and understood the corrida as an art form, requiring knowledge and respect to be judged. She had friends who were bullfighters. She visited them at the rings, and when someone from her aristocratic circle commented that that world was not for her, she looked at them with the same expression she used when told that gypsies were not for her, or that civil servants from Palencia were not for her. The expression of someone who has been hearing that line their whole life, and has come to the conclusion that it says more about the person saying it than about the world they are trying to fence off. The epitaph Cayetana chose for herself, "Here lies Cayetana, who lived as she felt," is deceptively simple and in reality extraordinarily difficult to fulfill. Living as you feel requires, to begin with, knowing what you feel. It requires the capacity to distinguish between what you truly want and what the world tells you should want. It requires the courage to act accordingly when what you truly want does not match what the world expects. And it requires the consistency to do all of that, not in a single moment of youthful rebellion, but over 88 years, from childhood in the palaces of Seville to old age, dancing barefoot in the courtyard of one of those same palaces with the husband she had chosen against the opinion of her children and the entire world. Cayetana de Alba was not a revolutionary in any political sense of the word. She did not challenge the system of nobility or question the legitimacy of inheritance. She did not renounce her titles or distribute her land among farm workers. She was, in that sense, entirely of her class. She believed in the noble institution, she believed in the historical continuity it represented, and she managed her patrimony with the seriousness of someone who understands she's the custodian of something that must outlast her. Where she was revolutionary was in the personal sphere, in the conviction that life was hers, to live as she chose, that the surname was a tool rather than a prison, and that no social convention had the authority to tell her whom to love, with whom to dance, or what kind of person to be. It was the smallest and most difficult revolution, the one of being yourself, without any context preventing it. Here lies Cayetana Fitz-James Stuart, who lived as she felt. If this story has reached you, if at any moment you found yourself wondering how it's possible that a person with that lineage and that fortune lived with that kind of freedom, Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Cayetana was the last great character of Spanish aristocracy, or the first of something different? The debate is open, and if you want more about the women who lived outside every rule their world imposed on them, this channel has more stories like this one. Subscribe.